In the 1970s, cocaine was not thought to be the kind of threat that it since proved to be.
Mathia Falco was the Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics Matters during the Carter administration. At that time, few people, even in government, thought cocaine was addictive. The focus remained on drugs that were deemed a threat to public health.
The major thrust of our policy during those 4 years was to try to reduce illicit opium production in order to reduce the availability of heroin in the United States. Cocaine was basically used by a relatively small number of very wealthy, the jet set, the rock stars. It hadn't really penetrated the society the way it did in the 1980s. It was still very expensive.
Cocaine is an exciting, euphoria-producing recreational drug. And most of the people who get into difficulty with it do
Dr.
so.
Peter Bourne was President Carter's drug czar. He still believes that cocaine is a relatively harmless drug.
1978, 7 people in the U.S. died from the effects of cocaine. 2 of them were people who were smugglers who'd swallowed condoms full of cocaine as they were coming into the U.S. so that it wouldn't be detected, and the condoms are then broken in their stomachs, and they'd had a massive dose of cocaine that killed them. But to me, it's probably on a par with skiing. If you're a skier, you enjoy the excitement and the thrill, but you can break a leg skiing if you're not careful. If you're very unskillful and unlucky, you may run into a tree and kill yourself. But cocaine is comparable to that. It's not a greater health threat than that. It's not a great, horrendous health problem. If I wrote something similar to that in 1974, I still believe that.
I admired Peter Bourne. I liked him. He seemed like a real gentleman.
Keith Stropp was president of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. He considered Bourne an ally, but in retrospect, he thinks cocaine helped kill the marijuana legalization movement.
There have been many people who've made the point, and I don't disagree, that the biggest enemy of marijuana legalization was when cocaine became popular. So long as the only recreational drug that people were really dealing with was marijuana, our arguments were forceful and effective, and the evidence was pretty strong that you could smoke marijuana and still be a successful businessman or businesswoman. It just wasn't a big deal.
One August evening in 1976, in a suburb of Atlanta, society's tolerance for recreational drug use would hit its limits. That night, Keith Sheward's daughter was celebrating her 13th birthday at a party in their backyard.
Well, he saw flickering lights, and he thought they were cigarettes, and that was enough to alarm us because we, didn't want 7th graders smoking in our backyard. They were stoned, but we didn't realize at the time the red eyes, the kind of foggy expression, kind of clumsily pushing each other around, etc., going right past us as though we didn't exist. And that's when we got alarmed and said, the party's over. Call your parents to come get you.
Sheward talked to her neighbor, Sue Rushi, the next day.
It was just stunning that kids from an academic and professional community where there weren't any divorces yet, there were few, if any, women working. None of the indices that suggested children might be at risk or anybody might be at risk applied to these kids, and yet there they were in the middle of it. And we were disbelieving when they came to tell us about it. It seemed so shocking.
We ran into a great variety of reactions. Some parents, absolute denial, not my kid, or quite hostile in response. Other parents kind of upset but couldn't believe it. What educated us was buying High Times and Head and all those drug culture magazines. Once we started reading them, we began to learn what all this stuff was all about and began to spot the cocaine razor blade hanging on, some adults around their neck, or all the marijuana emblems on things, etc.
Faced with this crisis, Sheward decided to go to the library. But she found almost nothing to substantiate her fears about the effects of recreational drugs such as marijuana on children. Instead, she found an article by Dr. Robert DuPont of the National Institute on Drug Abuse.
And so I fired off a letter directly to him at NIDA, very badly typed. I'm embarrassed to even look at it now, and just told him how upset we were about what seemed to be an undermining by governmental positions of what parents were trying to do.
I looked at that letter and I said, she's right and I'm wrong. A very simple point she made, which is, I still think is very profound, is she said, when we're talking about marijuana, let's distinguish between marijuana use for kids and marijuana use for adults. She also made very clear that this support for decriminalization was seen as being pro-pot, and that had a very negative influence. That had a negative influence in her life. That had a negative influence in people's families' lives across the country, and I was personally responsible for that. And that really hit home.
DuPont was a convert, but his friend the drug czar was much less sympathetic.
What they were saying was both ill-informed and so antithetical to the strategies that we were pursuing. They'd make a lot of noise and they'd say, you know, Carter's too liberal on drugs, we don't want treatment, we want more aggressive law enforcement, and these people aren't sick, they're criminals, and we want to lock them all up and put them in prison. And heroin isn't the issue, you know, it's marijuana smoking by suburban white kids, our children, that we're worried about. And quite frankly, Carter and I had regarded these people as pretty inconsequential gadflies that you sort of see in politics, but were really of no particular consequence, and we essentially ignored them.
In late 1977, Bourne came to Atlanta to give a speech. Seward arranged to meet him. She brought along what she and the other parents called the Bong Show.
Bourne really didn't understand the kid drug scene. He'd worked in heroin addiction and all kinds of things, and really believed that's where all our focus should be. And so I found him quite dismissive and rude when I met him. And I just, all of a sudden, started pulling out of my shopping bags all the bongs and the comic books and the paraphernalia and said, Dr. Bourne, this is going on right here now. This is kids we're talking about.
Police in suburban Washington say it was to this drugstore 1 week ago.
Bourne's days were numbered. In July 1978, he was caught writing a fraudulent prescription for Quaaludes for a member of his staff. And soon thereafter, Keith Stropp started getting calls from the press about a normal party that drug czar Bourne had attended.
I began to get calls from New York Times, Washington Post, everybody, saying, we heard that Peter Bourne snorted cocaine at your party. Is that true or not? Initially, I took the usual route of saying, no comment, I don't have any idea, whatever.
Then, in a sudden reversal, Stropp told the reporters to go ahead with their story.
I made what I think was, without question, the stupidest decision in my life. And I said to them, you won't get sued. I don't contradict what you're saying.
Bourne denied it, but the damage was done. President Carter could not afford the embarrassment.
And poof, the guy is gone from the scene. This was in 36 hours of the time the original Washington Post story broke. It was just very dramatic.
And I don't want to sort of seem so egocentric that suggest that the whole world revolves around me. But I think the real turning point in this was the moment that I left the White House. It ended the era of the focus on dealing with drugs as a public health issue. And from the point after I left, it then became a political, law enforcement, moral issue.
Once Peter Bourne was gone, the parents worked closely with the DEA on a national law to ban the sale of drug paraphernalia. They worked with the White House Drug Office to revise or replace government publications that they felt might be construed as favorable to drug use. And Robert DuPont asked Keith Seward to write a new pamphlet about marijuana for the National Institute on Drug Abuse Information. By 1980, the parents' movement had established more than 1,000 chapters nationwide.
We very much underestimated the power of that movement, and that movement, in my opinion, is what led to the next 20 years of the war on drugs. The last political victory we won was when we decriminalized marijuana in Nebraska in, I think, 78. And for the next 20 years, we didn't win a single significant political victory in this country.
Mr. President, in light of what appears to be a growing concern about the drug abuse problem, especially among teenagers, what will your priorities be?
In 1981, a new president was settling into the White House.
Policy on drug abuse.
Yes, I do. And in fact, it can be stated as clearly as this. I think this is one of the gravest problems facing us internally in the United States. I've had people talk to me about...
At first, President Reagan pledged to focus his administration on consumption or demand reduction. Interdiction, he said, wouldn't work.
Nations with borders like ours, that as the main method of halting the drug problem in America is virtually impossible. It's like carrying water in a sieve. It is my belief, firm belief, that the answer to the drug problem comes through winning over the users to the point that we take the customers away from the drugs, not take the drugs necessarily. Try that, of course. You don't let up on that. But it's far more effective if you take the customers away than if you try to take the drugs away from those who want to be customers.
Perhaps the reality of the drug war had not set in yet. At the time Reagan took over, the United States was already spending much more on law enforcement than on demand reduction, a reversal of the Nixon formula. And a crisis was unfolding in the streets of Miami that would pressure the White House to get even tougher. A business that once pretended to be fun and games had turned deadly.